Welcome back to What's the Big Book Actually Saying? Step 4, Sex Inventory. Before we get into the sex inventory per se, let's go back and review Step 4 very briefly, the main points that we've covered so far in the Big Book. Starts with this idea on page 64 that what we're doing is very akin to taking a commercial inventory in a number of ways. And I think the main point I'd like to make about that is if the owner of the business is to be successful, he, she, they cannot fool themselves about values. So we're at the last inventory with the sex inventory. So it's really worthwhile going back to this idea of the commercial inventory, the stock take, and looking at this analogy and seeing if it's true through the various inventories we're asked to take: resentments, then fears, then sex. The more a commercial business takes inventory, the wiser it gets. And that's hopefully where we end up. Wiser, I mean, through the 3 inventory processes we're asked to complete. We stop fooling ourselves. As such, each inventory we do fuels the next as we grow more aware of which of our shortcomings is triggered in what situation. So it's about looking for patterns, and you'll see this in the structure of each inventory. What we learn in the last inventory fuels how we work through the next. And we'll certainly see that in the sex inventory today. It could not be completed, in my view, without having done the first 2 and without what we learn through the first 2. To recap the resentments inventory, it's quite a stepped-out process. It's where we do a lot of our initial insight development. We learn things like instincts, and we learn that our perception of others, if it's a resentment producing, needs to be that they're a sick person we can pray for. We also learn that we can identify faults, flaws, shortcomings, and attach them to certain situations. And we also start to understand that really one of the key results, if we look at that 7th last step, is, and this is true of all inventories, we need to be getting willing to set matters straight, which is, of course, setting up steps 8 and 9. We leave this first inventory process armed with some important new insights. Which of our flaws or shortcomings, however we wish to describe them, are involved when we are triggered by certain situations? In other words, when we are restless, irritable and discontented. So the doctor's opinion is always front and centre through step 4 for me, because that cycle of addiction suggests that if I'm restless, irritable and discontented, all variations of resentment I might add, then the obsession that I can drink like a normal person is more likely to come up. So it's very important we know where our restlessness, irritability and discontentedness stem from. So we're building some armour against the cycle of addiction coming up in us again. With the fears, you'll see that we've learnt something about ourselves in the first resentments inventory we put into the fears inventory. We are a little bit more general in how we do it, and certainly the suggestions are more general too. We put them on paper. Columns aren't mentioned. We can put them on paper any way we like, I suppose. And we're ready to ask ourselves why we had these fears. And of course, fears come up again and again through the resentment inventory. And the point I'm going to make here is the knowledge about our faults and shortcomings gained in the first resentments inventory is put to good use in the second. We're asked to see a pattern in our fear-based reactions and perceptions. And of course, we were asked to start looking for patterns in our reactions in the first inventory. So maybe we're ready to really reflect seriously on whether the book's contention is right. Wasn't it because self-reliance failed us? Well, we've been thinking about reliance on self now for a good number of pages leading up to this critical question. And now we're ready to reflect on it in this second inventory. And then we get to the third and last inventory on sex. And let's see if what we've learnt through resentments and fears does carry forward into how we're asked to look at our sex conduct. Let's read from the big book, page 69. And now about sex. Many of us needed an overhauling here or there. But above all, we tried to be sensible on this question. It's so easy to get way off track. Here we find human opinions running to extremes, absurd extremes perhaps. One set of voices cry that sex is a lust of our lower nature, a base necessity for procreation, and just in case that's an odd word for you, having kids is what procreation's about. Then we have the voices who cry for sex and more sex, who bewail the institution of marriage, who think most of our troubles of the race are traceable to sex causes. They think we do not have enough of it, or that it isn't the right kind. They see its significance everywhere. It's a very universal statement that's, in my view, it's just an individual member's view, as relevant today as it was back in the late 30s when it was written. The big book continues. One school would allow man, and we should say man, women, whomever, no flavour for his fare, and the other would have us all on a straight pepper diet. What? I think this is one of the most confusing, analogous, maybe less educational sentences in the big book. It's the writers at their most florid. So let's simplify. What are we getting at here? Some of us are into the one type of sex over and over, whilst others are into some pretty diverse stuff, some pretty crazy stuff. That's all it's really saying. But the beautiful thing about Alcoholics Anonymous is the next bit. For it continues, we, in other words, the members of AA, founding members, want to stay out of this controversy. We do not want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. We all have sex problems. We'd hardly be human if we didn't. What can we do about them? So there's an important bit of information here, and not just about us and our sex conduct and staying away from a drink, moving towards God. It's about the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and why the book says we are not a religious program. But we're different than that. AA members in fit spiritual condition do not judge others on how they have sex. It's not our concern. We only look at this area because for many of us it's an area where we have sex problems. This makes it a prime suspect for prompting us to feel restless, irritable, discontented. So again, it's about this idea of avoiding the cycle of addiction. We understand sex is a big trigger for many of us, can get us restless, can get us irritable. And if you think I'm wrong about that, go to a few meetings and hear why people pick up a drink. And, I think that the writers were onto something when they asked us to inventory sex. I know that was true for me and many of the other members I know. So what we're saying here is, as a fellowship, you do whatever you want with sex. The issue isn't the sex or our enjoyment of it. The issue is how it gets us to treat others. So then we go straight into the process. And again, the book doesn't have the heading "the process" or brackets for how or what or where, but I'm adding those things to make it a bit clearer for you. Nor does it have numbered steps, but again, it's about clarity. That's why we're making these videos. So the book says, we reviewed our own conduct over years past. And then a few sentences beyond that, it also says we got this down on paper and looked at it. So there's the process. We think about all the sex we've had and with whom, and we start to write things down on paper. But what prompts the writing? And here is the big difference between this inventory and the last two. We're given specific questions to answer. And we're asked to look at our entire sex life and just populate the answers to these questions with as many examples as we can come to mind with. And here are the questions. It's the next part of the big book. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? Who had we hurt? Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Where were we at fault? What should we have done instead? So, when I look at my own personal examples, if I ask myself these questions with an open head and heart at a good time of day, What comes to mind are examples of where I have been selfish, dishonest, and inconsiderate. What comes to mind are the people I have unjustifiably aroused jealousy or suspicion in, and so on and so forth. And so it's quite a sophisticated process that we've arrived at via the first two inventories, where we're now so self-aware of our triggers and our patterns of harming behaviour when we're being triggered in such a way where our defects of character come out in us. We can now answer these sorts of questions and write down sort of open answers to open questions. Here, we are asked to immediately leap into assessing our past via the flaws and shortcomings we have now been made aware of through the first two inventories. We are using our new insight. Also, the process is more open. We are asked to reflect over our sexual history in general, then answer questions, or each question as required. So there you go. We move on. In this way, we try to shape a sane and sound ideal for our future sex life. We subjected each relation to this test. Was it selfish or not? So this is like the big killer hammer drop question. Now that we've got all of these previous encounters in our mind triggered by the questions at that second stage of the process, was it selfish or not? Now, let's go back to the first part of this third step. We are asked in this final inventory to develop an ideal with a future focus. So this is where we get to. We get at the third inventory to do something we perhaps aren't ready to do for the first two, which is to create a goal for ourselves moving forward, an ideal for our future sex life. And that is a very healing thing. And we're the only person who can answer that. And we get some advice moving forward as to how to create this ideal. But the idea of creating an ideal as a result of step 4 is an exciting possibility. So we are asked to literally accord ourselves spiritually from here on in, armed with all the facts about ourselves we've gained through this miraculous step 4 process. Step 4 here, the fourth step of this fourth step inventory, we ask God to mould our ideals and help us live up to them. So God, help me out here. And we're starting to use God, therefore, as a teacher in our lives. We're starting to build this process of asking God for advice, which we can then act on. God, help mould my ideals. Help me live up to them. It's a prayer we can ask our higher power on a daily basis if we wish. Whatever our ideal turns out to be, the big book continues, we must be willing to grow towards it. So willingness is here again. We must be willing to make amends where we have done harm, provided that we do not bring about still more harm in so doing. So here once again, the idea of growth is critical. And the growth is towards step 8 and 9. We must be willing to make amends, which is literally step 8, by the way, which we're growing here at step 4. And it's a pattern. We've been asked to be willing to make amends through the previous inventories as well. We move on. In meditation, we ask God what we should do about each specific matter. The right answer will come if we want it. So, here we're looking at our past so that we can move towards fleshing out this ideal, to know how to behave in future situations in a different way than the situations we've been in that we feel harmed others. It's a clever system. God alone can judge our sex situation. Counsel with persons is often desirable, but we let God be the final judge. We know that some people are as fanatical about sex as others are loose. We avoid hysterical thinking or advice. So this is a killer paragraph in the sense that what the writers are suggesting is, yeah, we can go to other members in AA and outside of AA for advice on sex, but be careful that, we're not going to people who are going to give us, advice that is fanatical or hysterical. And this is, something I do with members of AA and beyond. I'll look for the people who give me the answers I want to hear. And it's a really lovely, sane and sound suggestion to perhaps trust God instead of the fellowship. Trust God instead of the people we've been going to, while we were drinking and in early recovery. This is the process that we've agreed to pursue, leaving trusting others behind and instead trusting God. If we are sorry for what we've done, and obviously that's to those we have listed as having harmed, and have the honest desire to let God take us to better things, we believe we will be forgiven and will have learned our lesson. Now, some sponsees have said that kind of language, we're being forgiven by God's pretty Christian, and I totally get that. And this idea of trusting in God, it's really laid on quite heavily in this third inventory section of step 4 in the big book. And I guess that's because we're coming out of the inventory process and the writers feel it's time to reiterate step 3 again and what this whole thing is about, trusting in God, learning through God. But it does sound a little bit Christian to some, so I sometimes liken it back to the commercial inventory analogy we're asked at the start of step 4 to take through. And the way I would look at this paragraph through that lens is, if we recognise what we've done, buying items of stock that don't sell, and have the honest desire to let God take us to a more customer-friendly place, we believe we will be profitable. We believe we will profit and will have improved our business. Excuse that extra B there. And that's what this is about. We improve our business through creating more profit by having more customer-friendly purchasing decisions that lead to having better stuff that sells for full price on our shelves. The analogy is really strong. If we treat others differently in the future, we will have a different life and a different reaction from others as a result. And things churn up, they do not churn down. And there we end the inventory process in general. And there's a lovely little section at the end of this part of the big book that goes to generalisation about the inventory process. And it leaves us in a very good place, I feel. If we have been thorough about our personal inventory, we have written down a lot. We have listed our resentments. We have begun to comprehend their futility and their fatality. Ooh, there's that little kicker, isn't it, about death or steps. Choose. We have commenced to see their terrible destructiveness. We have begun to learn tolerance, patience, and goodwill towards all men, and I'll add women and people, even our enemies. How? Let's go back to our resentments inventory. For we have looked on them as sick people. We have listed the people we have hurt by our conduct, and if we haven't done that completely yet, do it now. Some of my sponsees will get to step 8 and they'll go, where did we write down all the people we'd harmed? Well, we meant to have done it in step 4, but if, let's just do it now. And are willing to straighten out the past if we can. So we leave step 4, if we do it properly, really set up for the amends process, which, if we're fair income about this finding God and getting sober, isn't that far away. And on that rather sobering note, have a happy, sober day. Cheers.